Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Naja Kasir, and I work at the CDPC, putting together these webinars, among other things. CDPC hosts this webinar series to connect drug policy advocacy to other movements, to get to the root of how and why some of our policies negatively impact our communities, instead of addressing the root causes of homelessness, poverty, lack of access to healthcare, criminalization, etc. This year, to confront the racist narrative surrounding drugs, migrations, border security, and in support of the people most affected by them, um, it was important for us to host a webinar around the themes of fear-based politics in support of the communities scapegoated by those, whether they be refugees, migrants, people who use drugs, trans people, etc. While working out the threads we would be discussing this year around these themes, Bill C2 and C12s were being pushed without consulting the impacted community as what looks like an expedited mechanism of mass deportation. These bills are driving deadly and wasteful policy decisions in government through spending public funds on military responses that drive violence and instability abroad, expending unchecked surveillance powers for police and border officials, as well as doubling down on prohibition, driving profits in the unregulated drug supply, both in Canada and around the globe. These bills allow Canadians to allow Canada, to deport refugees without hearing, as if by crossing the borders to Canada, they also lose their rights. This is happening in the midst of Ontario and Quebec, respectively, ending programs such as OINP and PEQ and impacting the lives of tens of thousands of migrant workers and students, sending shockwaves and distrust through immigrant communities who relied and trusted in these programs for their livelihood and waited years following every rules. We are meeting today denouncing these bills, asking for them to be withdrawn, and inviting people across movements to make those same connections that we are going to make today between drug policy and other issues. You can read our explainer detailing what those bills are and how they will make Canada's unregulated crisis worse. I will post the PDF in the chat as well as a link. On Monday, we also spoke at a press conference with the coalition calling for the withdrawal of these bills. I will also post the recording in the chat. Unfortunately, today, one of our panelists, Viviana Medina from the International Migrant Alliance, couldn't make it. And we were really excited for her to be here and share her perspective of migrant women in her analysis. But she will be replaced by her colleague, Mustafa Hanawi, instead. The webinar today will be moderated by Jaime Arredondo from the Canadian Centre for Substance Use Research. And with panelists, we will have Nick Boyce from CDPC, Joey Kalugai from Montreal's Immigrant Workers Center, alongside Mustafa Hanawi as panelists. Please, if you're attending today, share any calls to action in the chat. I will share a form and a template from the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group so that you can write to your MP, the Public Safety Minister, the Justice Minister, the Immigration Minister, the Prime Minister, and members of the CQ Committee currently studying C12, urging them to withdraw these bills. I will also share a petition asking to close the loophole and help stop Canadian arms export to Israel. So I will post all of this in the chat. Thank you, everyone. I will leave now and let you start the discussion, Jaime. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Naja. Gracias. Thank you to the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition to invite me to moderate this important talk. My name is Jaime Redondo Sanchez Lira. I'm a Canadian researcher in substance use and health policy at the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research. And also, as a Mexican researcher, I have a lot of interest on trying to compare exactly what happens across borders in North America. And I usually joke that, I'm from Mexico and I come from the future. And I can let you know some of the bad policy implications of many of the actions that are perhaps reflected on C2 and C12, which are bills that try to mix both the public security aspects around prohibition about scheduling drugs with some other really bad aspects regarding the persecution of migrants and the restriction of rights for migrant workers. This is something that we have seen south of the border. In Mexico, the country where I'm from, we have seen how, due to the pressure of the United States government, we have used the military to seal our borders with the argument that we are protecting Americans against fentanyl. However, the negative consequences of its actions have been really impacted by migrants who come from different parts of the world, either Central, South America, Africa, and Asia, and where we really see this argument that because we need to protect people from deadly drugs, we are mixing really what is human rights with public safety and leaving on the side the public health aspects of many of the solutions that we should be talking about. When someone reads these bills, C2 and C12, you can see that there are mechanisms to scheduling precursors to prohibit certain precursors to make fentanyl in a more expedited way that doesn't take into account really dialogue with communities and the negative consequences that this might have. That follows a path of the iron law provision where it has led us to go from opium to heroin to fentanyl to carfentanil and to other substances that adulterated and have created this toxicity drug crisis in our communities. We can also see some ways in the use of, for example, of the Coast Guard to now include it in this militarization of the border, insurance personal information of people who might be really trying to migrate because of human rights violations or just economic reasons. And we really are leaving behind all the social determinants of health that makes drug policy and human migration more of a complex issue rather than just trying to put more money in military, in prosecution, and in repression. So sadly, I see that these measures that had already been approved in Mexico with, for example, prohibiting fentanyl in the Constitution and other chemical drugs, using, like I said, the military, the Navy, and other forces to, in theory, stop the flow of fentanyl, but also stop the flow of people and violate the human rights, being replicated or want to be replicated in Canada. So I think this is a conversation that is really important for all of the Canadians and all the people who are listening to know the negative consequences that these actions might bring, and to learn that once that you give away certain rights and you militarize your borders, it's really difficult to go back. So we have several people who will tell us different competing and complementary views around these current issues. And first, perhaps if we can have just like a 2-minute introduction of who you are, what organization you work for, to lead us into the conversation. Perhaps we start with Joey, followed by Nick, and then Mustafa.
Hi, everybody. My name is Joey Kalugai. I'm with the Immigrant Workers Center. I'm the coordinator of the center, and I'm also in charge of the migrant workers outreach program and organizing program, which includes regions in Quebec, aside from Montreal, in Bas-Saint-Laurent, Chicoutimi, and Chicoutimi-Lac-Saint-Jean, and Outaouais, where we have organizers and offices. I myself am a son of a migrant worker who came here in the 1970s, and we fled the country during a time of a great upheaval during a Marcos dictatorship. Which was supported by, of course, Western countries like Canada up till a point. So I'd like to hopefully talk a little bit about the impacts of these policies and bills with migrant workers on the ground that we work with and see every day. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick Boyce. I'm the Policy Director at the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. I'm sitting here on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, or colloquially known as Ottawa. I've been with CDPC for about 3 years. Prior to that, I have a long history of doing harm reduction work in Ontario. And I'll be able to speak a bit more about some of the drug policy specific issues within Bill C2 and C12. Mustafa?
Thanks, Nick. So my name is Mustafa Hanawi, and I'm a community organizer also with the Immigrant Workers Center here in Montreal. but my focus, different than Joey's, to focus on um, precarious migrants who fall outside of the temporary foreign worker program. So working with asylum seekers, people working through placement agencies, uh, communities and neighborhoods like Park Extension, also working with warehouse workers. So, and then also beyond that, kind of writer, researcher, and writing on sort of international migration in the context of neoliberal globalization uh, yeah, and also member the IWC is of the International Migrant Alliance. So I guess which is what more of what I'll try to speak to is sort of the international perspective and sort of contextualizing what's happening here within the broader global context.
Thank you, Mustafa. So the way that we're going is we already made up a couple of times. We did ourselves. We're going to try to have a fluid conversation with certain guiding topics. But just to remind everybody that towards the end, we're going to have around 20 to 30 minutes to have open Q&A for anyone who wants to, have or going deeper into certain of the topics that we'll be talking. But perhaps just to start us up, Joey, could you tell us a little bit, kind of like those broad strokes about C2, C12. I know if you go in there, and I encourage people to go and read them directly, sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming seeing all those pages. If you don't feel like you want to do that, also the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, just like mentioned before by Naja, put on this really amazing briefing that has all the elements and other components. But perhaps, Joey, can you start us in that discussion?
Sure. So in just this year, the Canadian federal government introduced Bill C2, called the Strong Borders Act, and later reintroduced many of its provisions under Bill C12, which is called the Strengthening Canada's Immigration System and Borders Act. So it's presented under the guise of border security, immigration reform, and combating organized crime and trafficking. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So what are the key provisions of this bill? It's like one is to limit access to refugee hearings under the proposed laws. People who have been in Canada for more than 1 year could be barred from having their refugee claim heard by independent refugee determining board called the IRB, or the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. So it forces them instead into weaker administrative processes, such as the pre-removal risk assessments, or the PR or the PRA, with fewer procedural protections and no right of appeal. There's also the arbitrary and sweeping revocation of immigration status. The bill grants the government board undefined powers to suspend, revoke, or alter immigration documents, work permits, study permits, permanent residency applications based on vague public interest criteria with no clear safeguards or requirement for individuals. It expands surveillance and data sharing. The legislation enables the sharing of highly sensitive immigration and personal data, your identity, immigration status, changes in identity or status among federal, provincial, and territorial bodies, and potentially even with foreign governments or agencies. This removes previous privacy protections and exposes migrants to heightened risks of enforcement, exploitation, or deportation for simply seeking out support, medical care, or other social services. So for the Immigrant Workers Center, where many sometimes migrant workers who run from abuse and lose their status and try to access, for instance, labor standards or labor protections, they're assured that the labor board will not share their information to IRCC with regards to their identities and their immigration status. But under these bills, that's somewhat thrown away. So so you'll have many migrants who run from abuse or who are abused, who would either just suffer the abuse or run away and have no support because they're just basically too scared to approach any services or social services that can protect them from these abuses. So there's tighter restrictions on asylum claims for irregular crossings or delayed applications. For instance, if asylum seekers who cross irregularly between official border ports may be disqualified if their claim is made more than a narrow window, which allows, I think in the provisions it said 14 days or something like that, if they don't apply for or seek asylum within 14 days from crossing the border. So mass deportation and removal powers. The IRCC would have the authority to impose removal orders even automatically when claims are withdrawn or deemed inactive, enabling rapid deportations without proper legal procedures. So it's essentially the impacts is as we can see, it's an erosion of the refugee protections and violations of international law by denying many refugees a fair hearing, especially those who, for various reasons, cannot submit claims quickly enough. The bills violate principles like non-refoulement and undermine globally recognized refugee protections. There's increased vulnerability and precarity, exploitation for migrants, as I was just mentioning, because immigration status like work permits, residencies can be revoked arbitrarily. Many migrant workers face heightened risk of sudden deportation. And this instability can lead to greater exploitation by employers, fear of asserting their labor rights, or forced overwork to avoid detention, or being victims of labor trafficking and not having or feeling that they have no recourse because they would out themselves. So there's also a chilling effect on the access to services and support networks. There's expanded data sharing and surveillance means that migrants may avoid accessing healthcare, legal aid, social services, even when eligible, out of fear that their information could be used to trigger deportation or other punitive actions. Already, many migrant workers, when they ask us about accessing their rights, filing complaints, they say, will this have an impact on my ability to apply for permanent residency? With this act, with these bills, that heightened fear will definitely impact the perception, but also the reality of access to those services. There's the creation, of course, of the second class status and institutionalized uncertainty. So rather than enabling integration, the laws perpetuate precarity, making migrants perpetually vulnerable, uncertain, and subject to whims of bureaucratic and political discretion. There's the risk of mass deportation, as was mentioned already, and the tearing apart of families and communities. The broad and indiscriminate powers could lead to mass removals, even for people who have established lives in Canada, destabilizing communities and undermining social cohesion. So already, even as the bills have been enacted, we already, before these bills have been enacted, we already have the decision to hire 1,000 more CBSA agents. We have indication that of course, aside from the hiring, there's the hiring bonuses and benefits that's being dangled in front of people who want to join and become a CBS agent, and it's likened to the hiring processes of the ICE agents in the U.S. as they're trying to make it more, I guess, desirable to take on these types of jobs. But then there's also the screening of these agents. How do we screen the agents in terms of their faculties, their ability to judge and follow proper procedures and things like those. So there's that worry. We also have, in the meantime, we're also intensifying workplace and community raids. So according to reports in 2025, but as well, hearing from distressed migrants themselves in places like British Columbia and Alberta, whose workplaces have recently been targeted by CBSA. So these bills are actually a consolidated response to false narratives that we've been having throughout recent months and years about the housing crisis, the job lack of jobs, the economic crisis, the raising of prices and cost of living, where we're consistently been blaming immigrants and migrants for these crises itself. It's a false narrative because these are crises that is born out of its own neoliberal policies, that Canada itself and its neoliberal policies is its victim to its own policies. But we have a perfect sort of scapegoat for these crises, and we justify these bills as a response to this. The other thing that we should also look at, and I think it was already mentioned, is that we put immigration under the purvey of border security, fighting transnational crime, trafficking, money laundering, drug smuggling. And at face value, this is all about public safety, but in practice, legislation merges immigration control with criminal justice tools, turning migration status into a security problem. So this mirrors the logic of the war on drugs and scrutinizing frameworks instead of treating social issues like poverty, displacement, migration as political or humanitarian issues. They are recast as criminal or security threats. And migrants, especially racialized poor or working class, become framed as potential criminals, traffickers, or security risk rather than people seeking safety or opportunity. And the expansion of law enforcement, surveillance powers, data sharing, and revocation of legal status echoes policies used in the anti-drug and anti-crime legislation, which I'm sure Nick will talk more about. And by granting authorities the power to survey and revoke status without due process, the bill institutionalizes a kind of permanent suspicion of migrants. This reproduces a structural inequality where migrants are always at risk of being criminalized, detained, or deported, even when they have committed no crime. Moreover, the conflation of immigration enforcement and crime prevention encourages racial profiling, xenophobia, and policing of migrant communities under the guise of public safety, which Moose can tell you in his organizing in Park Extension is happening in particular with a large population of asylum seekers in that community. So the laws don't just regulate migration; they legitimize the use of criminal justice mechanism against non-citizens. And so why should this matter for us? And what's the border and moral political stakes? The bills represent a departure from what should be a more open and rights-based immigration refugee policy in Canada, and instead they institutionalize surveillance, precarity, and state control over migrant lives. These bills are in part a response to pressure from the Trump administration to address the border against irregular migration and a supposed flow of fentanyl across U.S.-Canada border. This Trump claim is followed by tariffs to put pressure on Canada to address this unfounded concern, which brings up the whole question of Canada's own economic crisis and the shrinking markets of these Western countries, and the competition that's happening between them, and the scapegoating of migrants and their victimization. So they erode trust between migrants and institutions, forcing people to live in fear, isolation, and invisibility. This undermines social cohesion, public health, and protections for all. They set a dangerous precedent where once migration becomes securitized and criminalized, other rights can be rolled back: free movement, fair hearing, due process. That shift does not only affect migrants, but it weakens democratic and human right norms for everybody in Canada. As we can see it unfolding and happening in our neighbor in the US. So they distract from structural causes of migration like war, inequality, climate, and displacement, which Mustafa can go into further. And they because migrants are framed as part of the problem rather than victims of a global system. So thank you.
Thank you, Joey. That was a pretty wholesome view. Many topics look there, but perhaps I think it's a good transition. Nick, if we look into the bill, it's interesting how Joey is mentioning, right? That this try to frame it first as public safety, fentanyl, drugs, but then you bring on all these aspects around immigrants and the restriction of rights. But then, something that is pretty interesting is how the discussion is really of other policy issues is absent, right? At a moment where, for example, the Dole founders are right now on court trying to argument a constitutional challenge on how to save lives, these bills really reduce our policy options just to interdiction, just to security, to share information, to money laundering. But it really leaves behind that there are many other options that could be on the table. And again, sorry to bring it over, but this is something that we have seen in Mexico, where really the government has defunded harm reduction and other elements of social policy to direct them towards border security, drones, army, interdiction on the oceans, now cooperation with the United States on rescuing people whose boats have been bombed on international waters. So it leaves really a lot of policy options that we should be talking about out there that is really not present in this important discussion. And perhaps, Nick, you can tell us more on how that drug policy component or absent of certain drug policy options is being talk about it in the bills, and then how it's being kind of like wrongfully mingled with this immigration aspect as well.
For sure. So there's and I think you're right. Like this is just a doubling down on prohibition approaches to drug policy, and an escalation of U.S. style militarized drug policy. So there are two main things. I'll speak specifically to the drug policy components within both Bill C-12 and Bill C-2 because they are identical. When Bill C-2 came out, there was immediate pushback around some of the privacy issues and other concerns within that. So they removed some of the most egregious pieces of Bill C-2 and introduced Bill C-12. They have not taken Bill C-2 off. So let's not forget that that is still there. That is all still there waiting. They're just trying to fast track some of the other stuff through Bill C-12. I'll just, before I get into the drug policy pieces, I will say too that the process for how these bills are being pushed forward is very concerning. They went and had first and second reading within the House, and then they're referred to committee where MPs are supposed to debate them and look at them and potentially make amendments and have witnesses and talk about them. Bill C-12 was referred first to the Immigration Committee. But in terms of sort of notifications around it and what was happening, it all happened very quickly. I think they announced what was happening on a Friday afternoon, and the witness list closed on Monday. So there was very little opportunity for people to actually apply to be witnesses at the committee. The Immigration Committee was supposed to have 4 meetings and then make recommendations and send them to the Public Safety Committee, where they were then going to study it. But the Public Safety Committee started studying Bill C-12 before the Immigration Committee had their third hearing. Very few civil society groups were invited as witnesses at the Immigration Committee. And the Public Safety Committee, I don't believe there's been any civil society witnesses. The Immigration Committee, too, has sent their a letter to public safety saying they have wrapped up their study of Bill C-12, but providing no evidence or no commentary, nothing. It was just literally a list of witnesses and the fact that they'd received 41 submissions. So it's deeply concerning that these seem to be being pushed through, that they don't want to hear any critiques, and they're just trying to ram things through. CDBC, we have made a submission to the Public Safety Committee, but again, people are still putting submissions in and they're already going ahead and starting to suggest amendments. There's no way these members of Parliament have actually read some of these submissions. So there's a whole sort of democratic process which I think is being sidestepped here, and that's deeply concerning too. But coming back to what are some of the drug policy positions specifically within these bills, there's two things that I'll focus on. One is around the accelerated precursor scheduling, and the other is a security mandate which has been given to the Canadian Coast Guard. And when we couple the provisions within this bill with the Canada's border plan, which was announced last December, almost a year ago, which was investing, I think it was about 1.5 billion in border security. And then you add on the recent budget that came out just a few weeks ago, which gives the Department of Defense a 40% increase while making significant cuts across health and social services. This is all just showing and demonstrating this doubling down and militarization on drug policy. So very concerning. Just another thing too is that when I'll talk about the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act in a minute, but the Minister of Health is ultimately responsible for the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So why are we referring this bill to public safety, and why is a public safety committee looking at amendments to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act? So again, it just shows a prioritization of this current government and what they're doing. So. In terms of the two pieces I was going to talk about, just for some context, in terms of what does it mean accelerated precursor scheduling? So just for some background and context, Canada primarily controls drugs through the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And that's a piece of federal legislation that we sort of sets the legal framework for prohibiting, regulating, and permitting activities involving different substances. And within that, there are different schedules, as schedules 1 to 4 that distinguish drugs based on sort of perceived health risks, potential for harm, recognized medical uses. So, for example, in Schedule 1, you'll have what's considered the most, and I'm using quote marks, harmful drugs. So you'd have things like opioids and cocaine in there, methamphetamine. You'd have Schedules 2 to 3 include substances that have varying risks, but maybe some sort of therapeutic use. So things like hallucinogens. And then Schedule 4 lists drugs that have more accepted medical uses, such as benzodiazepines. So, and all of those, depending on which schedule, those drugs are subject to different controls or different penalties. So the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act is then also supplemented by something called the Precursor Control Regulations, which impose requirements on the handling, reporting, importing, and exporting, the monitoring of different chemicals that can be used in the manufacturing of drugs. So what these two bills do is add a new schedule where the Minister of Health can temporarily schedule some of these chemicals temporarily and fast track where they will end up in which schedules. So it could be that through whatever means they identify that these new chemicals are being used to make some new drug, we need to control these. And it sort of bypasses the existing sort of regulatory processes and input from civil society, and the minister can just schedule stuff at their own discretion. So it's fast tracking things, and what that's doing, what the potential harm there is that, why do we have fentanyl in the first place? It's because, as Jaime said, we went from opium to heroin to the pharmaceutical opioids to now fentanyl. It's prohibition, it's the banning of drugs that doesn't address the demand for them. So there's always going to be innovations in the market. We're always going to find new drugs to supply the demand. And by fast tracking the precursor regulations, we're concerned that will just drive the markets and drive the diversification of drugs even more quickly. There are other concerns around that too. just driving the market innovation, but it also maybe for quote legitimate businesses, it can create regulatory confusion. It's just another layer of regulation. There could be impacts on industry and research, abilities to access some of these chemicals for existing legitimate uses. Many of these precursor chemicals are used in wastewater treatment or in water treatment or agriculture. And there's theoretically a risk that someone may be handling these chemicals and suddenly they've been scheduled and now made illegal. And has that actually trickled down in terms of the legislation and people's awareness and knowledge of this new law? And could be people being potentially sort of unintentionally handling what are now illegal substances. There are also provisions within the bills around financial investigations and trying to target organized crime at the financial level. But again, I think that's just going to drive, organized crime is always 10 steps ahead of government. And it's just going to drive in the same way that it's driven innovations in the drug supply itself. It's going to drive innovations in terms of how organized crime do business. And we just have to look at how much the government's spending in terms of prosecuting cases right now as things get more and more complex, the investigations get more and more complex, and the budgets get bigger and bigger. So those are some of the concerns around the precursor pieces within those bills. The second piece, which was something I hadn't sort of caught on to immediately, but has got my attention more because of if folks aren't aware, it got mentioned earlier, but the US has been conducting these illegal airstrikes on civilian boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific Oceans, supposedly as part of drug control operations. Within Bill C2 and C12, the Canadian Coast Guard has now been given a security mandate. So historically, the Canadian Coast Guard was a civilian maritime service, which has been focused on safety, navigation, and environmental protection. It was not a law enforcement agency. But I was not aware of this, but until more recently, but during the summer, there was a governor and council order that shifted the Canadian Coast Guard from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to the Department of National Defense. That's a significant shift. So who's actually now controlling the Coast Guard? It's now Defense. And then within Bill C2 and C12, it's given the Canadian Coast Guard an expanded security mandate. So they'll actually be working far more closely with the Navy, the military. There's provisions around information sharing there. And when you think back to, what's happening now with the US and these illegal strikes, is Canada complicit in some of these, egregious and outrageous human rights violations? So it's very concerning that the Canadian, and the resources that have historically been used for safety and navigation, environmental protection, is that going to suffer now that they're going to be doing other sorts of security type patrols? So, yeah, those are the main drug policy pieces, and happy as the conversation goes to expand on some of that.
Thank you, Nick. And I think I will come back to those topics, but I would like to move over because, all this aspect about immigration, it doesn't come out of nowhere, right? We have seen throughout North America an influx of people who then try to make it to the United States, then start being sent back to Mexico. Now, in other cases, to faraway regions like El Salvador or places in Africa where really they don't belong to. And where at some moment there was the hope for all these populations to perhaps try to pass by the United States and make it all the way to Canada as a safe space, away from violence and economic poverty in their places of origin. I myself, as a Mexican, have seen how Mexico has seen, depending on who or what the types of electoral times are coming, you get visa requirements, then not visa requirements. But then it's interesting how those visa requirements are a lot aligned with the interests of the United States and then also aligned with some regional governments, right? So we need to understand these international dynamics of migration and how perhaps Canada is really closing the doors to a lot of people who are in need in these moments. And perhaps, Mustafa, you can tell us a little bit more about these international perspectives and some of the migrant trajectories and what you're seeing with the organization.
Thank you so much, Jaime, and really glad to be part of this discussion and the way that it's coming together and sort of creating this analysis from this conversation. And I mean, in terms of contextualizing, I mean, Bill C-12, and not just Bill C-12, but the kind of the moment that we're in, I think is really important, because we can misinterpret actually what's happening, right? What the US political class wants, what the Canadian political class wants, or what's also happening in Europe as well. So, I mean, one of the things that you see in this overlap between sort of the war on drugs and the war on migrants is the manufacturing of a crisis, right? That there is, that this isn't actually an unmanageable crisis, but this is actually a manufactured crisis, especially in the United States, but not solely the United States, right? That this manufactured crisis is sort of part of a worldview that the US sort of needs to project in order to sort of use the kind of powers that they're using, right? So in one way, even with this whole question of tariffs, right? They actually need to manufacture the crisis that there is this war on drugs to use the kind of powers that they're using, exerting pressure on Canada, exerting pressure on Mexico to enact the kind of border policies that they're doing, or the way that they're using tariffs to leverage these kinds of different border policies, right? And also, when we look at migration and sort of in a zoomed out view, is that the levels of migration are actually quite stable, right? If you look at it, you know, roughly it's between 3 to 4% of the world population is living outside of their own home country, right? That's not a drastic crisis of this unmanageable and in terms of an unmanageable situation for particular states, right? That this is the same levels of migration that have always existed, right? And the fundamental difference is in two ways, right? Who is coming from where and who is migrating where, which has partly been discussed, and also in terms of the absolute numbers of migrants, right? So if you look at today, there are 290 million migrants in the world. 80% of that is from the global south going to the global north. Where, let's say, before World War II, or even around World War II, much of that was European migration, right, to North America, right, or the Great Migration, outside of indentured labor, forced transatlantic slave trade. So there's always been this two-tiered sort of migration pattern that has always existed, and that's what's being challenged, and that's what's creating the crisis, right? So if you if you actually look at what the US is trying to do and what Canada is trying to do, why the walls, right? Why the overt militarization, right? Which is, again, is part of this overlap, right? And Nick talked about this as well. So you have this move towards the externalization of the border, right? That, and partly using the war on drugs as that excuse, right? So for in Europe, the borders of Europe aren't in Europe anymore. They're in Niger, they're in Morocco, they're in Libya, they're in Senegal, they're in Egypt. So the borders of Europe have constantly expanded, right? To fight smugglers, to fight human traffickers, to deal with this crisis. In the United States, they've essentially exported their own border to Mexico, on the southern border of Mexico, right? And in Canada, there's a particular geography that has made Bill C-12 so fundamental in that process, right? And you can look at a lot of the pictures and the images that we see, especially from the United States, the militarization of ICE, ICE agents rappelling off of helicopters, the tearing apart of families and communities. And you would make the assumption that all of this is to halt the flow of migration, right? And that is, I think, one of the biggest misunderstandings, right? Because what the US wants, what Europe wants, is our immigration regime, right? Is our immigration system, right? Trump has been quite open about it since even his first term, right? Since 2017, he said what they want is a Canadian-style immigration system. And even Tom Horman, his border czar, and Trump again on Liberation Days, we're going to deport all of these people, and then we're going to bring them back legally as guest workers, right? And so what Canada has perfected in terms of, let's say, what they call migrant receiving countries is managed migration, right? It's the control of migration for the needs of capital, right? For the needs of big business, for the needs of employers. And so this is what the US is trying to achieve. And this is also what Bill C-12 is trying to achieve in another way, right? And so because in Canada, you have this rise in temporary migration, right? That's become structural, right? So you have the temporary foreign worker program, which gets expanded in 2006 to all of these categories, right? So beyond domestic work and beyond farm work, to people working in hotels and grocery stores, in manufacturing and food processing and healthcare. You had the structural reliance on international students also as a part of a cheap labor scheme, right? And a wealth transfer from the global south to the global north. And then at the same time, you have a growing undocumented population. You have, the estimates are really hard to tell, but the statistics range from 500,000 to 1 million, and some even above 1 million. So when you put the numbers of temporary migrants, undocumented migrants, international students together, it turns out to be, over 3 million people, right? And so it's a large portion of the Canadian population that is temporary, while Canada only admits 500,000 people as permanent residents. So what Canada's perfected is this two-tiered immigration system through a means of bureaucratic violence, right? So you have citizenship and permanent residency for those who are able to get it. So particularly, a mobile global elite, so as an investor class, or what now Trump has proposed as the gold card. You already have such schemes in Europe, and then also in the Gulf countries. They are Gulf countries. Permanent residency for skilled workers, which is constantly now being also attacked, actually, from these governments. And then you have precarity and temporary migration for those coming from the global south, right? And the fact is that Canada believed that it can do this as a faucet, that people won't actually demand equal rights, that people won't demand the same rights that all of us enjoy, the labor mobility, right? So the right to stand up to your employer and quit that job without losing your status. The same access to the services that Canadians enjoy, and the fact that all temporary migrants and even undocumented migrants actually pay for. And so what temporary migrants, all migrants in this country are asking for is nothing more except those equal rights, right? And you had this And because of those direct attacks, and also the changing political climate, Canada introduced a series of measures up before Bill C-12, actually. So before the election, Mark Miller, who had promised regularization for undocumented people, the center and many movements were part of that movement and believed we were shifting towards a right direction or a positive direction, that people were going to get status, that people were going to become regularized and no longer live in the fear of deportation, began to change on the dime, right? So the quotas on numbers of temporary foreign workers, the caps on international students. So you saw already this move in 2024 to begin to chip away on the number of migrants to appease a sort of a far-right base, or what was becoming a right-leaning sort of trend or movement, with Trump, with what you're seeing in the UK, in particular, also in Germany, to sort of appease that part of the electorate, because at the end of the day, temporary migrants can't vote, right? They have no electoral power, so there's no concern in terms of political parties to actually to try to meet their needs, right? And so this culminated with Bill C-12, and so what that has meant is that it's the ability to control migration, right? It's not about stopping migration in its totality, but it's about controlling migration when it becomes, so they'll turn on the faucet again when it becomes convenient and necessary for employers. They'll turn off migration when it's no longer politically convenient. And they'll do that through this process of criminalization, right? So again, also the cutting of visas from Mexico was this clear example, right? So, and you have this contradictory speech, right? So there's a war on drugs in Mexico, but how can anyone possibly be a refugee from the war on drugs, right? And you're beginning to see this process also with Venezuela, right? So we're going to bomb Venezuela because there's this crisis in terms of the war on drugs that we now have to fight. But how dare anyone from Venezuela reach our borders to seek asylum from the war that we're conducting, from the violence that we're conducting, right? So in some ways, people from the global south can be the perpetrators of this war on drugs, but cannot be the victims of it, right? And this is in order to be able to control migration, to control the narrative, and part of it is thoroughly convenient in terms of this nexus, right? Because who are the victims of the war on drugs, especially in the United States? I don't know whether the discourse is so pertinent here, right? That you have you have inklings of that discourse, that the war on drugs are a certain segment of society, right? White working class males who've been left behind from the ills of neoliberal globalization, right? That these are the communities who are suffering the rout of deindustrialization. These are the communities who and that migrants and immigrants are actually stealing their jobs, right? So and they're both the victims of the war on drugs, and they're also the victims of the war on migrants, right? Or the criminalization of migration, right? And so it's creating this narrative that's propping up their own political power and their own broader agenda, when at the end of the day, they have no desire to actually to provide the resources to deal with the core issues of the war on drugs, right? Because the fact is, those same communities, if they were to tell the truth, is that it's actually been corporate profiteering that's left those communities into the dust, right? Without any welfare state, the gutting of the welfare state, whether it be in the global north, whether it be in the global south, in terms of the privatization of education or healthcare, the removal of social supports, that's driving migration. And it's not like the reindustrialization of the global South has actually created poorer jobs, right? It's created hyper exploitation, right? Migration from Mexico to the United States or Canada jumped after NAFTA, right? It didn't lead to the development of Mexico, right? Yeah, and the same goes for Central America or countries in Africa. So there's this real packaging where there's actually the in terms of trying to create a counter narrative that actually to deal with the structural questions of migration and the war on drugs fundamentally means not the criminalization of migrants and drug users, but at the end of the day, a more humanistic and solidaristic approach that actually, that provides the resources to those communities and to those populations and removes a lot of those neoliberal policies that has driven migration, right? And then we'd have a much more, equitable world, because what we're seeing is that criminalization isn't changing anything, right? Just like the war on drugs, the walls in Bill C-12 won't stop migration. It's just going to make people more precarious. It's going to make people actually live in the shadows, right? So to be much more hyper exploited, right? And you're beginning to see this more and more, and much more of the work that we're dealing with is that people are here without status or without the right to work, essentially being lured into these scams, into fraudulent recruiters or placement agencies being told work, 80 hours a week, sometimes not paid, sometimes paid very little, and you'll get your work permit, right? Or the journey becomes much more difficult to the country. And so, and so you manufacture a crisis, much like that they did in Europe, right? So, and at the end of the day, the one thing that I want to add in dealing with dealing with this is that a lot of the myths that Joey covered in terms of the crisis of living, whether it be housing or state support, is that for a lot of undocumented migrants, for all of them actually, there is no access to these supports, right? If you're undocumented, you don't have access to healthcare. You don't have access to social housing. You don't have access to education. And even if you're a temporary migrant, you have very little access to these things, right? No access to employment insurance quite a few of the times, no access to social housing, no access to the education system, right? So in a lot of ways, these migrants actually have to support and subsidize that system, but can't take out. And I think that's something that's always a missing piece. And so, I think to make those links and to drive home that this is part of a broader agenda, and whose agenda does this serve, begins to raise, the serious questions of why Bill C-12, why now? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mustafa. Also, we can remember that, yes, a lot of migration is going from south to north, but we also have a lot of Canadians who have made Mexico, for example, their permanent place of residency. More than 50,000 Canadians going there, not only in Mexico, but in other places. Snowbirds going down the border during this time right now, trying to escape the cold. But also, Canadians now confronting the reality of the U.S. immigration system. For me, as a Mexican, I have lived that immigration system all my life. So I'm being confronted to what you're going to do with your fingerprints, additional security, something that I've lived all the time. And then now you can see how really you're not that equal or those different to the conditions that we live down the south right now. More security at the border, more registry, more information. So perhaps that should lead us into thinking a little bit outside of our privileges and trying to be more empathic with the problems of a lot of migrants around the world. I'm going to take the liberty to then jump, because we are half an hour there, to our Q&A, because there's a lot of questions being posed. And perhaps we can make it more shorter, a couple of minutes, so we can include everybody's and hopefully have the answers to all the questions. But then I would like to jump first with you, Joey, because a couple of questions were really direct towards what can we do? How can we protect the rights of people? And tying it up with another comment and another question there from my friend Shane, and it's also mentioning there, is how can we create this solidarity between the labor movement and also the drug policy movement that at times they seem really distant. But when we see bills like this one, it put us, and we are just a show of being sit down in the conversation, putting all of those elements together. How can we move forward? What can we do to improve the labor rights, but also to create more solidarity between the labor movement and the drug policy movement?
So, if I had the answer to that, I'd run for office. But uh, uh, I think I mean the question here is um, uh, who profits from that type of abuse and that type of vulnerability that we create with these types of policies and laws. It's not working class people. It's not the trade union movement that profits from that when the most vulnerable amongst us is easily exploited and abused. It puts into question the things that we fought for, like an 8-hour day, overtime, holiday pay, parental leave. All those things are put into question when the most vulnerable amongst us, when employers can simply say, you don't want to accept these conditions, I have a disposable workforce, a second tier of workers that I can exploit because you don't want to accept these lower, more affordable conditions for me, and more profitable conditions for me. I think we need to look at the interests involved in these things, and it's not and I think the differences and also supposedly conflicts and contradictions between workers are propagated in a way that it pulls the wool over our eyes. To think that to make us agree that it's immigrants who are at fault for the lived experience and crisis that we're facing. But at the same time, I don't think you can pull the wool over people's eyes for too long. People start realizing really quickly that it's not immigrants at fault here. And in fact, making a vulnerable sort of two-tiered workforce is not in the best interest of working class people. So even here in Quebec, there's a call for the Front Commun, Common Front, which is on November 29th, calling for all sectors and including migrants justice groups and other organizations fighting right-wing policies to come together against in a common front against all these attacks on labor. And I think that's the way to go. I think we need to continue to work together, and also for people who are advocating for drug users and policies that can address concretely the what you can call the drug problem. I don't know what to call it. This,
No, perfect.
yeah, and so I think we have more in common than we do have in differences, and we need to have these discussions to separate all these things that are being thrown at us to supposedly heighten the differences between these movements, and but in the end, it's an attack on working class people, and people should resist together.
Thank you, Joy. That's pretty important. I want to jump out with you, Nick, because another line of questioning is how do we shape policy, but how do we make MPs hear evidence? We are always in the world of like evidence-based policy, but it doesn't seem that they're listening to evidence. So, what reflections you have, and also as a Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, of, you know, how do we shape that process to create the bills, but how to communicate with MPs and also with the public in general?
Like Joy, I wish I had that answer. We are absolutely not doing evidence-based policy. It's all based on polling and politics, and I think maybe that therein lies part of an answer, is that until there is political pressure, which comes from the public, politicians are just going to keep doing what they're doing. So I think a large part of it is actually bringing the public on board and understanding the implications of a lot of this. And that is a huge ask, a huge task, these very complex issues. But that's when politicians start responding, is to public pressure. So I don't know how we tackle that. That is one of the things we're trying to think about. I think there's also, in the meantime, what we keep doing is putting in the evidence, because then we have it on record. But I don't know how you get those MPs to actually start paying attention to that until it's in their political interest. And I think that's a big part of the problem. And we'll leave today, and I won't get to it just yet, but we'll leave today with a couple of calls to action, because there are some things that we could ask people to do to try and increase that pressure on it. We'll come back to those in a minute, but I don't have a good answer to that, and I'd love to hear from people on the listening in if they have brilliant ideas around how we do this. Yeah. We're also working, there is trying to put some international pressure back on Canada, particularly from a human rights angle. Canada is looking for membership at the Human Rights Council, and Canada is under review in the spring, so we're looking at ways to maybe put some international pressure back on Canada from more of a human rights angle. But yeah, if anyone can give us those ideas, I'd love to hear from folks.
And I don't want to put anyone in that position, but I mean, maybe I'm just trying to have people run for office. But I think that one part that is really important is how we shape the public narrative, right? How do we shape the sentiment out there? And I would like to go with you, Mustafa, on the sense of, there's this belief you mentioned on it during your talk, about like blaming many things on migrants, right? On either the economic and housing crisis or wages. But do you have, and again, not easy answers, but then questions that we need to put ourselves in there. How can we talk to people about, what are the consequences of limiting this migration, or having, this aspect of making migrants kind of like the scapegoat for many of the problems that we have? And how can we create some empathy? How we can create some public points about what is really many of the things that is driving behind regarding, immigration restrictions and border crackdown?
I mean, I think part of changing the narrative, a big part of it is people, seeing the realities of who these migrants are, right? And I think that's why part of our strategy at the center is always to do that, because and you're beginning to see that actually in the US, right? Like where there's a much more solidarity and sympathy, and there's kind of a backlash to what Trump has done, right? And so that these are the people who might go to school with your kids, right? Like that these are the children who also go to school with your children, right? And these are people who are doing the sort of continue to do, right? Like during the pandemic, we had this moment where there was all of this empathy and solidarity, right? That these were people who were working in the hospitals or in the front lines, or who are quote unquote essential workers. But now, essentially, we want them just to be invisible workers again, right? That we don't want them to be visible. And even a lot of the times that the logic doesn't make sense, right? So if you look at what we're doing, so that I think a lot of the arguments fall apart pretty easily, right? So we tell, Carney, they say that migrants are the problem, that current housing problem, but then we want to bring more migrants to build houses, right? So what is it? Our healthcare is the exact same thing. So it's a strain on our healthcare, but we need more migrants to do the jobs in the healthcare system that no one wants to do, right? In Quebec, it's the same with the garderies. Refugees and their children are excluded from subsidized gardener daycare, but then are the ones who staff all of the daycares, right? And so I think that there's this, the empathy is that people are already here, they're part of the society, they've already contributed, and what they're asking for is simply equality, right? It's your neighbors, it's the people that we all rely on, and they're not asking for anything more or anything less, right? And that the idea also that and it's there's a lot of questions about, our migrants aren't stealing the jobs, right? Like there's, I have a friend who say that, there's the existence of migrant jobs, right? Whether it be agriculture, whether it be working Uber and all of this, and that that the conditions aren't good. But if you made those conditions good, if we saw this as valuable work, if we saw this as important work to our society, that we would again have a lot of empathy, right? So you have, even a lot of disdain, let's say, for South Asians who are working in Tim Hortons, right? There's all of these tropes and racist sort of terms now for people coming from India, particularly Sikh or Punjabi, who are working in Tim Hortons as international students or temporary foreign workers. But who the hell wants to be working in a Tim Hortons at 3 a.m.? And essentially, a lot of the times are frontline community workers, doing that job. But we haven't really shown the empathy of their lived experience. So I think that's the thing that we really need to sort of focus on, that will create maybe a sense of solidarity, and then also really a breakdown about, and I think all the speakers, who really has profited from the withering of our our social programs and the welfare state, right? And so to tackle these two together, it's not easy, but we don't have to look very far back in our own recent memory to realize that there were moments when there was quite a bit of empathy. So really, the stories of these migrant workers, the stories of where they migrated from, always attaching the question of, this is the other thing that's never really part of the narrative, is that we never discuss why people migrated. Why are people here? Where did they actually come from, right? And once you get into that narrative too, then there's a quite a bit of empathy, right? And maybe even deep understanding that we might have caused the causes of their migration in the first place, right? So that is a fundamental part of that work, but that has to happen at the grassroots level. That's not at a policy level, right? That's neighbor to neighbor, that's in the schools, that's in these workplaces, that's in these communities, because a lot of the times the places that vote the most xenophobic or are the most susceptible to these views actually have the less migrants, right? But then are inflicted by the same problems, right? Like, I use this example a lot. Shawinigan in Quebec is the least diverse place in Quebec, right? It has the least amount of immigrants, but the cost of housing has doubled, right? So the idea that you're going to blame migrants and immigrants on a housing crisis when there are practically none really shows that it's about finance, and it's about the financialization of housing, right? And which is affecting poor communities, which is affecting all of us. So these coalitions, but it's at the grassroots, and it's not going to be at the policy level, because I think once there's that understanding, and maybe these liberal politicians begin. I mean, it's more advanced in the U.S. where now there's a fear, there's a real backlash in terms of this anti-migrant sentiment, and because people are really beginning to see that humanistic side because of the level of violence enacted on migrants, right, in the U.S. But we haven't reached that point. But that's, I mean, hopefully we don't have to get to that point. But the work that we have to do is always is that kind of cross movement, or having those discussions, and that's work on us of bringing the lived realities of migrants into these other spaces.
Thank you, Mustafa. I want to address, Beverly has made a couple of questions, but I think gonna address one for you, Joy, where it's mentioned the drug panic as a tool of labor control. You have mentioned before, I think the United Nations has deemed the temporary worker as a modern slavery, right? That also creates a lot of mental health problems. Perhaps a lot of these workers might also have substance use problems, but if you use drugs as a tool to control, as a tool to, if you report me, if you report some problems, and that might put in jeopardy my work and my future, how can you ask help? So can you mention a little bit about that, about like this drug panic as a tool to labor control?
Sure. Just an anecdote to one workplace where we did some organizing and exposure of abuses. In Quebec, there are what we call a sector called the chicken catchers. So for us, what we see is like when you go to a grocery and buy a chicken, or you buy your chicken at McDonald's, that's what you see. But and then we have these things about free range chicken and so on and so forth, as part of this sort of advertisement to better living and better eating. Those have a migrant component in it, and you have what you call chicken catchers, which is very interesting to many people because they never knew that there's such a job. And there's hundreds, if not thousands, of migrant workers from Guatemala in particular who come, and Honduras, who come and do these chicken catching. They're basically subcontracted by the chicken farms to go into these chicken coops where you have free range chickens, and they have to catch 5,000 chickens per day per person. So, handling these things and the sort of the quotas imposed on them, and the health and safety of these workers in these conditions, aside from the injuries involved in that type of work, it causes sort of this pressure for migrant workers, and they work 60 to 80 hours per week, almost more than, almost double the, or if not doubled, the regular hours of work of common Quebec workers who are permanent residents or citizens. And in order for these workers to survive these very harsh work conditions, we were told by them that the supervisors, who are told by the company owner, goes out and deals drugs to them, provides them these drugs, and it's their coping mechanism for these harsh conditions. So with this entry of the drug panic, already the employer uses all sorts of tactics to put pressure on migrant workers to accept these types of conditions, in particular to their closed work permits, which is what is the modern day slavery, because who is titled to only one employer, and you can't leave, or else you get deported. It's like what kind of system is that? That harkens back to slavery. That's what the UN rapporteur is trying to say. And even with that, and now with this whole drug panic, well, we are the ones providing the drugs to have these workers cope. And then you have this extra sort of menace where you can say, hey, I can call the police on you because you use drugs and you can easily be deported. So shut up about your rights and suck it up and work and do what I tell you. So these restrictive measures don't address the issue, the core issue of why these social issues come up. There's structures involved, and the restrictive measures only exacerbate the situation at hand for vulnerable people.
Thank you, Joy, and thank you for sharing that powerful story. I want to also acknowledge Crystal, who has made a lot of questions. I'm gonna, choose one, but perhaps it's a little bit hard to talk right now on where the war on drugs originally started. It will take us like perhaps the entire panel or just a different panel. But then I would like to shift it a little bit, if that's okay, Crystal, towards Nick, which is how are we still continuing the war on drugs, and how these type of bills put us into that narrative that seems to be inescapable for MPs.
Well, I think that's where it comes back to educating people. And I did notice a couple of comments and questions about the history of all of this, and blaming immigrants and people who use drugs and LGBT folks. It's always been about a tool of social control and scapegoating, and not dealing with fundamental structural issues. Drug prohibition specifically, was founded on racist, classist, colonial ideals, starting with banning alcohol for indigenous folks under the Indian Act while other people still had access. And then opium, and many Asian cultures were using that, but we banned opium. So this is just, it's an ongoing thing. And many of the MPs that are sitting in these rooms have not thought about the history of drug prohibition. They've just grown up with the war on drugs, with this idea that drugs are bad and people who do them, it's immoral people doing illegal things. And people deserve to be punished. And so it's just an ongoing extension of that. And I think we have to do a much better job of trying to unpack that history for people. And then also understanding, like, it sounds gross to say this, but where are your tax dollars actually going, and what are the actual impacts of where we're spending? So if we look at spending under the controlled drugs and under the Canadian Drugs and Substances Strategy, it was about between 2017 to 2023. We put money into law enforcement, prevention, harm reduction, and treatment, but it was almost 70% weighted to law enforcement. Now, with Canada's border plan and the budget, I'm going to think 90% is going to law enforcement. And what are the consequences of that? It means that while we're seeing the Department of National Defence getting a 40% increase in their budget, we're seeing 15% cuts across Health Canada and other health and social programs. So, we're taking away from things that really address the demand for drugs and support for people. Yeah, I think, a lot of that explaining and unpacking of history and looking at the true impacts of current policy is really needed. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Mustafa, 1 minute perhaps to close us down.
I mean, there's not much to add, except I think the Bill C-12, as bad as it is kind of a moment that's bringing a lot of different parts of civil society, of different movements, people thinking about different related issues together in the same room. And I believe that this is, if anything, maybe a benefit in the long run to be positive, right? We can be really negative about this moment and really pessimistic, and it's really easy to do that. But it has been a long time where, thinking about a broader narrative and thinking about these kind of coalitions or networks or points of solidarity that, hadn't existed in the years prior. So in trying to figure that out, I think it's going to create real meaningful social change in the long run. And so how do we begin to continue these discussions and to foster that, once BC12 is actually, whether it gets enacted or not, or how it gets enacted, that we don't let it go and that we really continue to challenge it, I think is going to be the most important thing in keeping these coalitions together, right? Because at the end of the day, they're trying to really premise this on a divide and rule, and if it shows that it's not actually working, then they won't be able to implement their agenda. And in this criminalization, the one last thing that we see that really impacts us, talking to Najah about this before, is that that the more you force people into precarity, the only part of the economy they become part of also becomes criminalized. So in Europe, I mean, this nexus has really become prominent, right? Where a lot of migrants who become undocumented aren't just, are become sort of channeled and funneled into the drug economy as the only source of labor, right? Once they become undocumented, and that's become also remanufacturing a crisis. So again, there's this sort of spiraling and self-fulfilling prophecy. So, I think the way we build these coalitions and we have those conversations, it's really going to affect those communities who are being targeted and scapegoating, right? And that a victory for migrant workers, a victory for those communities, those drug user communities and populations who are being stigmatized and criminalized, will actually be a victory vice versa, right? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Joey?
Yeah, just very quickly, it's something to be said about capitalists digging their own graves when they put policies like this that encompass all aspects and impact a broad number of people, is that people come together to oppose it. So they dig their own graves by doing these things.
Thank you. Well, with that, I think what is really important from this table is that if we don't talk about it, it remains hidden, right? So thank you for the opportunity to Canadian Drug Policy Coalition to host us tonight. Also, we have a lot of calls of action that we're putting up in the chat. And I don't know if Najah, do you want to have a last message for everybody who joined it today?
Thank you so much to everyone who joined as attendees and all the conversations and comments in the chat. We really appreciate. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you, Jaime, for moderating. That was amazing. And of course, thank you to Coop Largo for the language interpretation. I don't have anything to add. I think so much was said today. And again, this is recorded. We will post the recording, and we will also, all the resources that will be in the chat, we will send them alongside the recording in the email. So again, just really appreciate this moment and these important conversations that we're able to have. Last note that I will end the webinar on is we encourage everyone who works in other fields than drug policy or migrants' rights to kind of hopefully you were able to take the connections that we made here and apply them to your fields and to the people that you advocate for, because at the end of the day, like all of these root issues that we have to fight against are connected. So yeah, I will leave it to that. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.